Hello everyone and welcome to my talk at BES 2020. My name is Dominic Martin. I'm a PhD student at the University of Göttingen in Germany and I'm in the very last weeks of my PhD. I did my PhD in the transdisciplinary project Diversity Turn in Land Use Science, studying land use change in tropical northeastern Madagascar. Today I will present a synthesis work of our project talking about a land use trajectory which reveals recurring conservation opportunities in the biodiversity hotspot Madagascar. Madagascar has had ongoing forest loss for many years, and since the 1950s, as you can see on the skiff, roughly 40% of forest cover has been lost. Today, I focus on the northeast of the country, where forest loss has been mainly attributed to shifting hill-rise cultivation, where slash and burn is used to grow rice on these slopes. However, there has been recent debate about the role of vanilla agroforestry in driving deforestation in the region. So hopefully at the end of the talk, you will know whether this Guardian article is actually true or not. So in the Diversity Turn in Land Use Science project, we study on the one hand, what influences land use decisions, but also what the consequences of those decisions are. For example, stakeholder needs and aspirations, for example, for the need for sufficient rice and production drive land use decisions. You might have also heard about very high vanilla prices in recent years, which drive land use decisions in the region. Additionally, there are governance issues which have been studied in our project, also related to land use in northeastern Madagascar. On the other hand, there are the consequences of those decisions for biodiversity, for ecosystem services and functions, as well as for agricultural productivity. Today's talk will mainly focus on the right-hand side on these consequences of land use decisions in northeastern Madagascar. What I present today builds on teamwork, builds on a large international and interdisciplinary team, and on the ecologist side of the project, I would like to highlight the work of my colleagues on plants, on amphibians and reptiles, as well as on birds and insects. Here you can see an overview of our study landscape. You can see it's very small scale, very heterogeneous, very diverse landscape. And here in this landscape, we identified the most common land use types to study. For example, there are hill rice fields, which are the result of this shifting cultivation. When these are abandoned, fallows develop on which woody plants emerge, resulting in woody fallows. Then there are forest fragments in the landscape, as well as old-growth forests in a national park. And lastly, there are two different kinds of vanilla agroforestry. There are vanilla agroforests that are directly established inside forest. So you can see here how farmers have removed the forest understory, planted the so-called tutor tree, and then hung up the vanilla liana on this tutor tree. And you can also see these remnant forest trees spanning across this vanilla agroforest. These forest-derived vanilla agroforests make up around 30% of the agroforests in the region. The other 70% of the agroforests are fallow-derived, so they're established on woody fallows that formerly form part of the shifting cultivation cycle. We worked in 10 different villages, as well as in 2 sites inside Madagascar National Park, where we found the old-growth forest plots, but the other land use types are really spread through these villages, resulting in a semi-blocked design. And these different colors which are used here, you will find throughout my talk. You might have read in the title that I was talking about land use trajectory. So what do I mean with that? The idea of a land use trajectory is to really think about possible transitions between land use types and how they might change through stages with time. So on the x-axis, you find stages 0 to 4, and on the y-axis, you find hypothesized outcomes for biodiversity and ecosystem functions. At stage 0, which is the historic baseline in our study region, we find old-growth forests. These old-growth forests can be converted either to forest fragments through selective logging and fragmentation, or they may be used for slash and burn, for, agriculture, resulting in these hill rise fields. Or, of course, they can also be conserved so that this old-growth forest is maintained. Thereby, we can identify a first conservation opportunity at these old-growth forests. However, forest fragments can be further transformed into forest-derived vanilla agroforestry, or can be burned for hill rise cultivation. Again, of course, there's also the option to preserve a forest fragment. Thereby, we can identify a second conservation opportunity at this stage. The hill rise fields, irrespective of their origin, will evolve into woody fallows, and these woody fallows represent a third conservation opportunities, as they can be either conserved or transformed to fallow-derived vanilla agroforests, or again be burned to continue shifting cultivation cycle for hill rise cultivation. We now can use these three conservation opportunities to study trade-offs and co-benefits between biodiversity, ecosystem functions, and agricultural productivity, thereby representing real-world dynamics in this landscape in Madagascar. Overall, we have data for 7 taxa as well as 5 ecosystem functions. To visualize this data and make it more comprehensible, we use the approach of multidiversity and multifunctionality. I'll briefly explain how these values were calculated, as it's important to understand the following plots. So for example, if we have a focal plot with 20 tree species, we can compare this focal plot to the average of the top 5 plots for this taxa across any land use type. So the focal plot might be a fallow-derived vanilla agroforest, and the top 5 plots for the trees, maybe 3 old-growth forests and 2 forest fragment sites. And we can compare this focal plot now to this top 5 plots and check whether a threshold has been passed. So in this case, we use a 50% threshold. So we check whether the focal plot has at least 50% of the tree species of the top 5 plots, which is not the case in this example. However, the herbaceous plant actually passed this threshold. From these different data, we can then calculate plot level multidiversity, which in this case, where 4 out of 7 taxa pass the threshold, would be 0.57. This data can then be aggregated, of course, for all plots of that land use type and be compared between land use types. We also use the same approach for endemic species as well as ecosystem functions. Coming to the results, you can see for multidiversity at the 50% threshold that this was highest at the historic baseline in old-growth forest. You can see that the transformation of old-growth forest to forest fragment comes with a reduction of multidiversity. However, the alternative, the transformation to hill rise, actually comes with a stronger loss of multidiversity. At the second conservation opportunity, which is forest fragment, we can see a slight gain in multidiversity if this is to be converted to forest-derived vanilla agroforestry, and again a loss when fire is used to have a hill rise field. These then recover to the woody fallow stage, and here at the third conservation opportunity, we see a slight increase of multidiversity if converted to fallow-derived vanilla, and a decrease again if converted to hill rise. For the endemic multidiversity, the results are somewhat similar, but a bit more extreme. So you can see that old-growth forest really stands out here, and that again, there's a loss of endemic multidiversity if converted to forest fragment, and a stronger loss if converted to hill rise. The second conservation opportunity, we see stable outcomes if converted to forest-derived agroforestry, and again, a strong loss of endemic species if converted to hill rise. Generally, you can see that once this land had been used for hill-rise cultivation. So once fire was used, then lots of endemic species are actually lost. So preserving these land use types which have not experienced fire, old-growth forest, forest fragment, and forest-derived vanilla, is really important to conserve endemic species. Lastly, you can see the results for multifunctionality, where we find the highest multifunctionality in old-growth forest, and relatively high values still in forest fragments, but very low values throughout for the other land use types. One key advantage of this approach with the conservation opportunities is also that we can directly compare all different indicators, both species as well as functions and agricultural productivity in this case, compared to each baseline. So for example, in the first case, the baseline here is the old growth forest, and we can see that we have losses of biodiversity and even stronger losses of endemic biodiversity compared to this old growth forest stage. Similarly, the functions are reduced if the old growth forest is converted either to hill rise, which is the beige, or to forest fragment, which is the blue. Of course, also the other conservation opportunities can be really evaluated like this, so that each transformation stage can be directly compared to the current stage at these conservation opportunities. Again, here you can see the losses if forest fragments are converted to hill rise throughout, and relatively stable outcomes if converted to forest-derived vanilla agroforestry. Third opportunity, you can see stable outcomes for fallow-derived agroforestry and losses again if converted to hill rise. I would briefly like to focus on the agricultural productivity. And here you can see that the conversion of forest fragment to forest-derived vanilla agroforestry here and here, as well as the conversion of woody fallow to fallow-derived agroforestry, really comes to the benefit of high profitability. I mentioned previously that the vanilla prices were very high during our study phase. This really shows that this vanilla agroforestry is highly profitable. For hill rise, you can see that the productivity is there for the yield, so they yield, but the profitability per unit labor and per unit area is very low, as the labor input into this crop is very high. However, the hill rise cultivation is very important for food security, as many of the households who farm hill rise have few other crops to rely on. In conclusion, I think it's very important to understand this landscape along this trajectory, because otherwise we might evaluate land use options that are not happening, that are not realistic in this setting. With this approach, we could identify old growth forests as being particularly important for endemic species. We could also highlight the importance of these not burned land use types, forest fragment and forest-derived vanilla agroforest for biodiversity, and we can identify fallow-derived vanilla agroforest as an opportunity to increase profitability without losing biodiversity and ecosystem functions. We can conclude that there's a closing window of opportunity for old growth forest conservation, just as these forests are lost. That forest conservation entails trade-offs, as there are benefits for hill rise yields and for profitability in the case of vanilla. So these trade-offs need to be compensated for, or other incentives are needed. We also show these co-benefits of fallow-derived vanilla agroforestry, which is also something we highlight in a review published earlier this year, where we show that forest-derived agroforestry is a degradation of tropical forest, whereas open land-derived agroforestry rehabilitates open land. Lastly, I would argue that this trajectory approach is also of value elsewhere and may help to prioritize conservation action at conservation opportunities that are closing, as well as at conservation opportunities that have a good cost-to-benefit ratio. I would like to thank all my colleagues, funders of this project, and follow me on Twitter to hear more. Thank you very much for listening.